We're going to start with the program this morning. We actually have a great program this morning to start the day on antitrust and competition in high-tech industries. Obviously, a critically important issue. How the government, because how the government applies the antitrust laws can have a significant effect on innovation and investment. The major antitrust case of the latter part of the 20th century, the Microsoft case, was and continues to be controversial with widely divergent views on whether the prosecution of Microsoft was positive or was harmful to innovation in the software industry. A similar debate is now developing around Google because of its relatively dominant position in the search market, and the authorities have been looking closely at Google's activities. Most recently, the FTC scrutinized Google's acquisition of AdMob closely before allowing it to go ahead. Intel, which is also represented here on the panel, has been under more or less constant investigation for more than a decade, and was recently convicted of antitrust violations in the EU and recently settled a major case with the FTC. Apple now seems to be coming into the antitrust crosshairs, and the EU recently opened an investigation of IBM. So the basic question is whether antitrust can improve the performance of high-tech markets, which are characterized by more or less continuous innovation, and if they can improve it, if so, how? And in particular, a threshold question is whether whether high-tech markets are different as far as antitrust is concerned, and whether economists are able to predict the effects of any antitrust actions and remedies on innovation. If they can, then enforcement agencies can take those actions with greater confidence, but if they can't, if the effects of various remedies on innovation are uncertain, then obviously the lesson for antitrust is different. We really have an outstanding panel to discuss these issues, and I'll introduce them very briefly, and their more extensive bios are in the program. Going in order, Tim Bresnahan is the Landau Professor of Technology and the Economy at Stanford. He's a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economics in the Antitrust Division, where he was involved in the Microsoft case. Doug Melamed is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Intel. He was the head of the Antitrust Practice Group at WilmerHale, and he served as Acting Assistant Attorney General and Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Antitrust Division from 1996 to 2000, which was also at the time that the Microsoft case was active. Hal Varian is the chief economist at Google. Prior to that was a professor at Berkeley, and currently is an emeritus professor in the business school and the economics department and the information management department at UC Berkeley. Christopher Yu is a professor and the founding director of the Center for Technology, Innovation and Competition at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Prior to that, he was professor at Vanderbilt and a clerk for Justice Anthony Kennedy at the Supreme Court. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give opening remarks of maybe 5 minutes or so, and then maybe I'll ask a few questions, and then I will throw it open to you all. So start with Tim.
Good, thanks, Tom. So Tom gave us a study question, which is how should the antitrust agencies think about innovation in the course of investigations and lawsuits? And I thought about that study question for a while, and it turns out many scholars have engaged on this question with what I'm going to call move the needle analyses. Meaning, so if you take, a lot of them would say innovation is very important, our tools for, say, merger analysis, which is most of antitrust work, are static. Our tools for Section 2 analysis, monopolization analysis are also static. Innovation is very important, so we should move the needle. You see me moving the needle to the right, to my right, to your left. You know, there should be less antitrust because innovation is very important. And then you got some other guys who, I don't know, maybe David Teese is probably the leading exemplar of the move the needle to the right school because innovation is very important. And then you got some other guys, and here I bet the American Antitrust Institute provides us with the leading examples of the other way. Innovation is very important. You know, we know there's lots of industries where only innovative entrants are ever going to do anything. You hear where I'm going. They say move the needle to the left. You know, our tools of static analysis will underestimate the importance, say, of mergers and preventing future innovation, and we should do more of it. And as you can probably guess, the reason I introduced the scholarly debate this way, and I think I've accurately characterized 95% of the writings by calling them move the needle writings, is to reject the move the needle idea. I think the answer to the question, what should the antitrust authorities do about innovative industries, is like most antitrust questions, an extremely industry-specific and fact-oriented question, and that the answer to it ought to be evidentiary. If the plaintiff in a merger case, usually one of the agencies, really believes that the merger is going to take away future innovation, competitive innovation between the two merging parties in a particular industry, they should not rely on broad general economic research, which would say competition is pretty good for innovation in general. I don't think that the in general is a move the needle argument, and I'd reject it. Instead, I would give them the burden of showing that in this particular context, really valuable innovation going forward will be lost. Now, I'd apply that same burden on a defendant who says, leave us alone, we're going to merge.
Why do you look at me when you say the word?
No, sorry. A hypothetical defendant who says, after we get together and merge, we'll be able to do new and innovative things. And that should make you look past whatever competitive problem there might be in the present. Again, I would say that shouldn't rely on the non-existent broad general empirical finding that most mergers lead to synergies of innovation, but surely there are situations in which that's the right way to think about it, and they could be demonstrated evidentially in the matter at hand. So I would treat innovation as another part of the future, just like prices after the merger. I would treat innovation as another part of the future, like the prices after the monopolizer gets rid of the rest of the competition, and say it's a industry-specific evidentiary problem. Now I have to take Tom's bait on the Microsoft case, since I did work on it, and I'll use it to illustrate my innovation point. Sometimes you'll get a case where, say, this is not a hypothetical case. There's a not particularly innovative incumbent dominant firm which is surprised by outside innovation. attempts to compete against the outside innovation on the merits, fails. 4,500 people in the Internet Platform and Tools division at Microsoft lose to the 150 kids in the startup. Fails through competition in the merit and has to use complete control of the distribution channel to contractually, not technologically, to block widespread distribution of a competitively threatening technology. Okay, so that's Microsoft, and I'd say it's not particularly surprising 10 years later that if you think about where's all the innovation in individual user-oriented computing, there's an enormous amount of innovation in individual user-oriented computing in, but it's not in the PC operating system or in the Microsoft browser. It's on the server side. It's in sub-PC devices. It's in the PC hardware. It's sort of everywhere else. So that matter left a not particularly innovative dominant firm in place, and 10 years later we got what we deserve for that, a not particularly innovative dominant firm that's worth about half as much as it was in the stock market because those guys have caught up to its ineffectiveness as well. Okay, probably went over 5 minutes.
Doug?
As Tom said, I was at the division from beginning to end, well, not the end, from beginning till the filing of our appellate brief in the Microsoft case. I thought it was a good case. Tim and I worked on that together. I thought it was a good case. But my recent experiences caused me, as Carly would have put it yesterday, to maybe put the emphasis somewhere else in terms of where antitrust enforcement ought to be. I start with the following. Antitrust enforcement can really interfere with innovation in several ways. It can do it by directly restricting the innovation process by, for example, imposing restrictions on product design or on innovation-creating collaborations. It can do it by interfering with the ability of innovators to appropriate the fruits of their innovation by, for example, duties to license IP or other duties to deal, and that can reduce incentives for innovation. It can do so by creating uncertainty about what the legal rules are, either because the rules are unclear or because they're applied unreliably because of a flawed fact-finding process or process of application of legal principles to facts. And uncertainty in turn creates risk and deters investment in innovation. And it can do so by increasing transaction costs or time to market for the innovator if there are a variety of governmental reviews or hurdles, or if innovators have to spend a lot of time transacting around legal rules in order to get their innovations done. Given the importance of innovation in the economy, given the risks to innovation from antitrust intervention, it seems to me at the very minimum we ought to start with the notion that antitrust ought to be based upon predictable rules that minimize these kinds of costs and that are enforced by adequate procedures that ensure reliable and predictable outcomes. Now, it doesn't mean no antitrust enforcement, but it means antitrust enforcement cabined by that kind of rigorous principled approach. Now, at this point, others will say, I expected Tim actually to say more full-throatedly than he did, something along the following lines, because I remember myself saying it in response to Microsoft in the mid-90s. Wait a minute. We're not concerned solely with the ability of the defendant, the putative defendant, to innovate. My concerns seem to be focused on him or it. We got to be concerned with innovation in the market as a whole, and that means we have to make sure that the law is adequate to protect the would-be new entrant, the innovator on the margins, and so forth. Because if not, we'll have the problem Tim alluded to. And that the premise is clearly right. Antitrust law has to be focused on innovation in the market as a whole. So the question then becomes, well, what does that do to the principles I just suggested? To be sure, one can imagine situations where a more interventionist approach would, in theory, be appropriate in the name of intervention. For example, suppose IBM tweaks the design of its product, an interface, that has a very marginal but real improvement to the performance of the cost effectiveness of the product, but has a devastating impact on a competitor who needs access to the mainframe through the interface. You could look at that and you could say, well, gee, that unbalance looks like a bad trade-off, and shouldn't the government intervene to say, well, you can't do it under these circumstances because unbalanced you've harmed innovation. Or one can imagine an argument where a defendant has already reaped more than enough reward to justify his investment in R&D, and maybe now's the time to impose a duty to deal so others can take advantage of that technology and make leapfrog innovations and the like. In theory, you could imagine all sorts of circumstances like this. But my fear is that there are a lot of people around the world who believe that theory should be translated, should be manifest in legal principles that simply say, kind of in the spirit, I suppose, of what Tim was saying about fact-specific, industry-specific investigations, where you find that, go ahead and intervene. And I think that would be a dreadful mistake for innovation. I think we have to have principles that are quite different from that. And I think there are three basic reasons for that. First, principles that would legitimize intervention in those two kinds of situations that I mentioned and others like them would invariably be hard to apply accurately. So you would have unpredictability and error in the application of those principles to the facts at hand. Imagine, for example, that when IBM improved its product, there were engineers who said, have you noticed one of the good things about this is it's really going to lock out our competitor? Now, the fact finder might actually think that observation shed light on the relative welfare implications of the benefit on the one hand and the locking out on the other hand. The lawyers for the company would be afraid of that, and so you'd have the innovation process inhibited.
Actually, if I could interrupt, apparently we're getting feedback because people might have their cell phones on, so we should all turn them off.
I should turn my cell phone off. Okay. So one would worry about the reliability of the fact. Secondly, I think there's a huge mistake in the way we talk about antitrust a lot, in the way we talk about through the Microsoft case. And that is people focus on it, in spite of their best efforts often, as if it's a regulatory problem. Have we fixed the Microsoft problem, is the question people often ask about the Microsoft case. Antitrust enforcement by the government affects a handful of cases each year. It's a drop in the commercial bucket. But what antitrust enforcement does indirectly is affect millions of decisions made by businesses every day, by businesses who are not defendants and hope never to be defendants. That's the true importance of antitrust enforcement. It is the signals it sends to the marketplace, the guidance it gives to businesses around the world. It's what we might call the market externality of antitrust enforcement. It's why we enforce murder laws, even though I've never known of a murder case that actually resurrected the corpse. It doesn't really matter that much whether the Microsoft operating system monopoly was or was not adequately cabined by the law. What really matters is whether the signals that were sent to the marketplace were prudent signals. And if you look at it that way, ad hoc intervention, or intervention that makes fine distinctions that are hard to apply by courts or hard for firms to administer in real time when making their decisions on the fly, are likely to be counterproductive, irrespective of whether not making those kinds of interventions might in individual cases leave some anti-competitive conduct unremedied. The third reason, and I just want to say this briefly, but it's something that has increasingly come to my attention, as you can imagine, and I think a lot of people's attention. I talked about the market externality of antitrust enforcement. There's also an intergovernmental externality of antitrust enforcement. 120 countries now have antitrust laws. A half a dozen of them are active enforcing those laws, often on the same transactions, the same conduct in the global marketplace. In the UK, Germany, EC, the United States, Japan, Korea, probably soon China. Some of these countries use antitrust in name to achieve other objectives like indigenous innovation. Some of them, rightly or wrongly, like the EC, have less appreciation for the importance of protecting the appropriability of the fruits of innovation, for example. Some of them just don't have the competence and the ability to do sophisticated antitrust well. All of them are looking to the United States and to some extent to the EC for guidance and for legitimization of different enforcement approaches. If the United States, for example, were to be aggressive about requiring licensing of intellectual property, restricting product design, I suspect in deciding whether to do so, it should take into account the intergovernmental externality, by which I mean the likelihood that doing so would legitimize those tools by governments less well motivated or less capable than our own, and who could use those tools in the global marketplace to really wreak havoc with innovation. And that externality ought to be taken into account, and it seems to me as another reason for caution in the area of antitrust intervention where innovation is at stake.
So to follow up on this theme of innovation, the big problem with innovation is by its very nature, it's impossible to predict. As economists, we think we might have something to say about how prices are formed, but it's very, very difficult to say which way a high-tech market is going to go with respect to innovation. Andy Grove once said only the paranoid survive, so every company that has a successful franchise is naturally, I think inevitably, going to be paranoid, and sometimes they overstep the bounds of competition policy and get slapped down by the antitrust authorities. And this is how I look at the Microsoft case as an example of this inevitable paranoia and the overstepping the bounds with respect to tactics that would be acceptable business tactics in our economy. Now, at the end of the Microsoft case, I would say everybody had, there were three conventional truths that many people believed. One, Microsoft was invincible. Two, Apple was dead. And three, there was going to be no more progress in browsers. And I think all three of those pieces of conventional wisdom were true for about 2 years. And then Microsoft began to look not quite so invincible, and Apple began to look like it was rising from the dead. And of course, browser competition eventually resumed. Now, it's very hard to complain about deadweight loss and traditional economic concepts in an industry where prices are falling in half every year or two. So the emphasis has got to be on this issue of innovation. But I think that the most important idea to keep in mind is that we really can't predict which way the innovation is going. So the basic principle has to be first, do no harm. I mean, you would have to find a situation where there are really egregious violations of appropriate business tactics. That seems quite reasonable to have the authorities step in and try to prevent, but trying to somehow shape the course of innovation seems to me to be totally outside our control. Now, in many cases, what would normally be competitive discipline, that is discipline in terms of practices that come from competitors, actually in high-tech industries often come from complementers, that is the providers of complementary products and suppliers in some cases, rather than competitors, because there may indeed be a temporary monopoly or a temporary dominant player in a particular industry, and in many cases the other members of the industry who are appropriately paranoid provide some kind of discipline with respect to practices that go on in that industry. And I think this is something that's almost characteristic of high-tech industries and quite different than you find in other parts of the economy. So maybe that's a good point to end, and we'll follow up on some of that in the discussion.
Chris?
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I'd like to basically make 3 points. And I want to move the discussion away from the way we normally talk about innovation. So an antitrust lawyer, when you say, oh, the relationship between antitrust and innovation, as Tim says, you think mergers. Most of us who would think about it think innovation markets under the IP guidelines, get off in this idea of product market definition and the troubles of how you do it. And that's been difficult. But I think framing the issues in that way overlooks some very, very important points about the way technological architecture affects innovation in ways that are overlooked by framing it in a classic antitrust analysis. So what would I say? First, the vast majority of the concerns in the high-tech industry these days are vertical. So we're concerned about Apple's exclusivity arrangement with AT&T, their control of the App Store, We're concerned in the Microsoft case about browsers, potentially applications. Again, not a horizontal market within, but a vertical relationship with another industry. Intel and Google are both familiar with these issues. They arise with every major high-tech company there is. So the question is why we've never done well with vertical things, and the antitrust analysis has never done well, because vertical relationships are inherently ambiguous. One, vertical competitors are simultaneously cooperative and non-cooperative. So if you have a shoe manufacturer and a retailer, they don't make money unless they sell product, and they have a cooperative interest to maximize the sale of that product. But once they sell that product, they're in an adversarial relationship over how they're going to claim the spoils of doing so. And so, in fact, what we will see is this really oddly schizophrenic relationship inherent in those channels. In addition, what we've seen through the writings of other people is that very interesting institutional relationships, strategic alliances, can actually be pro-competitive as well as anti-competitive. Tim mentioned David Teese. David Teese has a wonderful article looking at why innovators who have ironclad patent protection often lose in the marketplace. And the reason is very simple. It's because very rarely is a patent by itself a product. It usually has to be combined with other inputs to make a marketable product, at which point you have to bargain with someone who often has a better bargaining power than you do. Let's say a monopolist with controlling some key resource. And in fact, if you go into that nakedly, you generally, especially after you've made investments in it, you're going to lose. So what do? Before you lay down the investments, you enter into strategic partnerships, potentially mergers, and you have, in general, alternative institutional arrangements coming right out of the new institutional economics of ways you can make that go. The other example is, in fact, they can be non-cooperative in very, very interesting ways. And the rivalry can take many, many forms. There's a wonderful book chapter written by Tim in a book edited by Tom, which I recommend to all of you, where he talks about divided technical leadership, where you have people who've got a market nicely striated, let's say call it devices, operating systems, networking, applications. And what they do is they start crowding around outside the edges of that to try to attack adjacent markets. And what Tim points out is this is a form of divided technical leadership that's good. If we left them in their cozy markets, we have a word for that. It's called division of markets. It's a classic anti-competitive tactic. But what you may see is them invading each other's markets in ways that can be quite competitive. So to take an example, Apple and Google, sitting on each other's boards, had a very cooperative relationship. Ad search, devices. They've now become intense rivals. Google is selling a phone in competition with Apple. Apple is now doing things in the ad search space to try to compete backwards. And many people would have an instinct to regard this as, oh, this must be anti-competitive. In fact, as Tim's work pointed out, this is could be a sign of a very healthy rivalry between two systems competitors trying to work in different ways. And what's interesting to me is that, as Shane pointed out yesterday, is that also standards competition can be a sign of innovative health in a way that's very useful. To use another example, I think this explains the changing relationship between BitTorrent and Comcast. BitTorrent took advantage of the fact they were attempting to manage the congestion in the network at the application level. And what they finally realized is they're now involved in the P4P discussions in a very cooperative way, because they realized that they could opportunistically take advantage of congestion in the short term. But over the long haul, if they congest the network, and if the network is not functioning properly in local nodes, that's going to hurt all applications, including them. And so what they are now engaged in is a cooperative venture where they're figuring out, okay, this is a short-run win, but a long-term losing proposition for us. We have to find a way out of this. So these are going to be very, very difficult to discern when these things are cooperative actions and adversarial actions are enhancing competition and innovation or not. The second point I wanted to make touches on a point that Doug made, which is we naturally think about interfaces and changing interfaces as hurting competition. And actually, this also comes up in remedies under the Essential Facilities Doctrine, where you compel people to provide access at a certain point, which also means an interface. And there's a whole literature about how this promotes competition. Modularity and standardized interfaces unlocks innovation because everyone knows if they design it to fit that interface, everything will work great. Well, as Doug pointed out, that locks that interface into place, and interfaces are subject to technological change and sometimes can collapse altogether. We've seen that over the years. But what's interesting to me is the whole notion of modularity and standardization in this way is a two-edged sword, as recognized in the economic literature, in ways that is generally not discussed. Well, first off, standardization sacrifices product variety. It's a standard result in the literature. And that, in fact, there are circumstances where the benefit you get from consuming a different product dominates the benefits of being part of a larger network. And so, in fact, the move away could be, it's largely a function of how heterogeneous the preference is on the market you're facing. If everyone wants a different thing, you should naturally expect them to start to spread out. But more importantly to me is that the way modularity works to enhance the stack, the way things work, is basically by hiding information. It constrains interactions between the different modules in the stack to a very narrow range. And that is what unlocks the innovation, because you don't have to know what's happening inside the black box of the adjacent level. You just say, all I have to do is worry about these two inputs, that's what passes through the interface. Well, the problem is there is innovation that needs different information to pass through those interfaces. And that you see this all the time. It constrains the way they interact. So what's the classic example? Congestion in a network is right now principally managed by computers operating at the edge. There's an inherent informational problem with this. You need to know what all the other users are doing to understand congestion. It's like you need congestion driving on a freeway. You need to find out what all the other drivers are doing. The information of that cannot pass through the current stack the way it's configured now. Now, there's all these jury-rigged solutions. There's one called explicit congestion notification, which tries to work very hard using different layers to work around it. But at some point, the engineering community is saying, in fact, this modularity, which we're lauding as this great innovation, engine of innovation, is inhibiting certain kinds of innovations in ways that you can't understand by defining product markets and looking at it that way. The other thing that's really interesting, the third point, first is the verticalness, modularity problematic, and the third point is how architectures can change the speed of innovation. And there's a wonderful literature there's the classic literature on network economic effects on lock-in, which is widely misunderstood because lock-in is ambiguous depending on the circumstances. It's not a general result, and that's often misrepresented in the literature. There's also a sociology literature of this, people who study the sociology of technology that stems off of Kuhn, that looks at how a certain technological paradigm filters information through organizations and guides young researchers, PhDs in the academy, as well as R&D people in the industry, in certain technological directions, in ways that can actually make it very, very hard to inhibit innovation. And that you put in a design hierarchy, when you think about it, if I'm at a level and I want to do if I'm doing a standalone innovation, if it's in a modular stack, I've got to convince the people in the layer above me and the layer below me to modify what they're doing as well. And that becomes incredibly difficult to do. So what we take away from this, I agree with Tim, it's very context specific. We have to understand the fact that these practices tend to be ambiguous. They can only be understood in context. I do think Shane's caution yesterday that this kind of changing standards is a sign of innovative health, and that we should always bear in mind that, in fact, we should expect standards competition and things to change. And I would also really bear in mind Coase's famous quote from the 70s, which is he said, anytime an economist sees a business practice they don't recognize, their first instinct is to grab for a monopoly result. And the answer is, sometimes that is the case. I don't mean you can't rule out that theoretical possibility. But what's interesting is we have a much richer appreciation that that's often not the case, and that by taking that reflexive reaction, we might rule out a lot of practices that are actually promoting innovation.
Thanks. Let me ask a few questions. Well, let me get back to maybe one of the basic questions, and everybody alluded to it in different ways, but just to clarify it for me, I mean, Tim, and I wasn't sure exactly how he would answer this question. Tim said, well, you need, obviously it needs to be industry, context specific, but in innovation, you kind of treat it like prices. You analyze it you analyze it and try to see what the effect is. And Hal in particular said it's very unpredictable. I think the new merger guidelines in their very brief section on innovation kind of tries to force innovation into this more standard antitrust context. But let's go down let's just go down quickly. And I mean, it's fairly standard to be able to predict, the effect of a merger on prices, or at least relatively standard. So the question is innovation very much different than that in terms of being able to predict the effect of an antitrust action on innovation relative to prices, or is it Can we just go down and maybe get a quick answer?
To the extent I understand the question, it's probably much rarer that the effects of innovation on innovation of a antitrust action or its absence in either mergers or monopolization cases can be predicted. And that sort of natively pushes you in the direction of more caution. As it's harder for the agencies to bring a case where the theory of harm is harm to innovation.
And also, let me just add to that question. Should the authorities in cases like that, particularly in high tech where innovation is important, should they basically ignore the effect on prices and just basically try to focus on the effect on innovation?
Well, I don't think the agencies are going to be good at all in predicting innovation in the individual case. There may be some exceptions. That pharmaceutical case, not Genzyme, but Genzyme, whatever, the one that Tamir spent a lot of time. I think he probably did a pretty good job on the particular facts there. But generally speaking, I don't think the agencies are going to be able to predict innovation. I'm not sure even the VCs do that. We hear what 10% of the startups succeed. How good are they? And one of the reasons for that is that I think there is, as I understand the literature, a much less robust and certainly less well understood correlation between concentration on the one hand and innovation on the other hand. Certainly the lack of concentration is going to, while it may eliminate significant portions of the incentive, for example, for price cutting, probably doesn't have anywhere near that kind of impact on the incentives for innovation and so on. So I don't think that antitrust should be based on the ability to predict the likelihood of innovation in the individual case. It should be based more on principles that over the massive cases are likely to correlate with economic conditions conducive to innovation. And the answer to the last aspect of the question, I suppose if we had some confident belief that action or inaction would have a significant impact one way or the other on innovation, I guess that should trump our concerns about deadweight loss. But in the absence of that confident prediction about innovation, deadweight loss becomes obviously a very relevant criterion.
Well, I would say it's this conflict or this difference between innovation and prices is particularly clear when the products that are being discussed have a zero price. So you could look at the browser as an example, where there was a lot of discussion about Microsoft's role in dominating the browser market, and I'll put markets in quotes because they were all given away for free. And the argument there was that if you had this very dominant player who could bundle the browser, it would discourage innovation. And I think that was actually right for a few years, because we saw the browser stagnate, and eventually you got some new entry, or entry gathered momentum, and there has definitely been technological progress and innovation in that area, I would say, in the last 5 years or so. So even though I think it's very, very difficult to predict which direction innovation is going to go in any particular market, we might be able to say something about what factors are conducive for an environment in which you will see innovation, and one of the factors has got to be ease of entry. So there are some other factors we could look at. This question of standardization, I think, is one that, as Chris said, is a two-edged sword. But in many cases, having a wide set of available component parts is going to stimulate innovation just through this process of combinatorial innovation, where lots of people are trying different ways to make things work. I think we're in a very, very exciting period now, because there's so many different modules that can be connected to create new innovation. So we're living through a real burst of innovative activity at the moment, and my own belief is this is going to continue for several years as we work through the possibilities with cloud computing and other innovations of this sort.
The economic literature on this is vast. There's all these theories that how monopolists have sort of an X-inefficiency style to overinvest to protect their monopolies. There's other theories that believe otherwise. There's a long-standing two theses. Ken Arrow says small companies are more innovative. Joseph Schumpeter says large companies are more innovative. There are books, surveys that are book length of articles and articles and articles, and the best I would say is that they're indeterminate. And they try to break it down to other factors. So it's not size, it's size plus something else or something which again puts us towards a context specific where it becomes analysis, where it becomes difficult to generalize.
So I agree with Christopher that the theory is indeterminate. There's a very substantial empirical literature, mostly using non-antitrust, but government sourced changes in competition. You know, does a tariff fall dramatically? Does a railroad get built? In the older literature, and that finds that if you were going to go one way, you would go in the direction that more competition leads to more innovation measured by productivity increase.
And it gets even harder.
Which isn't the same. Which is not the same as saying that in any particular matter, you know how to resolve these difficult issues.
And by the way, it's not necessarily saying size either. You could have entry from other large firms who are in an adjacent industry.
Yeah, exactly.
So
size seems a red herring.
It's interesting too because the other instinct that Tim notices, there's a lot of people, the default instinct is to say the dynamic benefits of innovation, even if there's short-run losses, are going to dominate. And in fact, that's actually not obvious to me either, because you may get long-term entry, but you get short-run losses, short-run static losses. It depends on your cost of capital you're putting in. It depends on the length of the entry. Again, we're framed by the merger guidelines to frame this in 2 years. It may not be, my gut reaction from an innovation standpoint is drawing on the existing literature on essential facilities doctrine, that's probably too short because entry is a long-term entry may still be worth bringing in ways that are important. But the other thing that I would bear in mind is that you have to think about how the architecture does affect innovation here as well, which is it promotes innovation, as Hal points out very correctly, that is consistent with the existing hierarchy. It actually retards stuff that's not consistent with it. And then the question is we have to combine it with things like entry, things like market structure, where if you have 4 players in the market and one of them wants to deviate from the hierarchy, the market's not structured in a way that that's likely to lead to bad results, because if they've got a better idea, they should allow them. If they've got a bad idea, they're going to get hammered. Or if they have a niche idea, they may actually deviate from what everyone else is doing. As was said last night, we may have 3 internets. In fact, we think of the internet as a unified network. We may have to think more broadly about this in terms of a space.
Let me pick up on something a little different, something that Doug was talking about, this point of antitrust sending a signal, well, a couple of signals. One is a signal to the marketplace, and the second was a signal to other governments. And let's start actually at the other end now and talk. First of all, let me just ask the specific question: did the Intel case, and I know Doug may be constrained on how much he can say about this, what sort of a signal did the Intel case, and perhaps other recent cases that have been brought, send to the marketplace and to other governments about antitrust enforcement?
I think it says that product market definition is going to change, that we now look at graphics processors that used to be separate from CPUs. We're now understanding that, in fact, you can trade them off and put used to be CPU processing into the graphics card, and that, in fact, we can think about this more flexibly, and that it's an illustration of how we think that sort of, what I would say is Tim's work, this may be good, this may be bad. It could be a form of systems rivalry. And we see this, there's a whole line of computer cases where Wi-Fi cards or disk drives or modems used to be external devices which are now integrated in. And we see these change over time, and it's very, very difficult to see, but that's the problem we're facing.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. There are a lot of really exciting things going on technologically in this area of using GPUs as substitutes for parallel processors. The kind of architecture that Google has with these huge arrays of separate CPUs, in many cases, those calculations can be replaced by graphics card computations, and people are trying to explore the possibilities there. So from the end user's point of view, they're definitely partial substitutes.
I don't know if you all want to opine on this. Is the Intel settlement good for consumers?
did it do anything? I mean,
Yeah.
did it, I mean, actually spent a lot of the summer reading all of the current administration's settlements. It's actually quite settlements. They haven't won a case yet. It's really quite interesting. I mean, that one, you know, in round numbers, Doug can disagree if he's like, you know, a couple of other firms and anybody else should they enter now enjoy what AMD already had from its private lawsuit. So I would say the FTC's, you know, VIA and NVIDIA have rights that that AMD broadly had in its settlement, and not much else happened.
Well, I can't resist. I got to say something. First, I actually was interested to hear what signals did it send, because I would have answered the question very differently, and maybe it reflects the myopia of being in the middle of it, or maybe it reflects the wisdom of knowing about it. I would have thought frankly, that anybody who was participating in the market in a meaningful way already knew the extent to which GPU-centric computing might or might not be an alternative to CPU-centric computing. I don't think that's news except to the, to the outsider. To me, the important signal of the Intel case was that U.S. tech firms with high market shares will be accused by governments around the world when they compete aggressively by novel forms of competition and on the basis of accusations that rest on very dubious economic foundations, which in terms of signals to the market, unfortunately, often, I guess always, or I guess you said always, are never litigated. So those the fallacies, in my view, of some of those theories are never fully laid bare.
But actually, I think all the insiders knew that too.
Well, yes, but the problem then is not that we learned it, but that it is a fact. So I'm struck that no one said it.
Let me take a poll that will help me on Doug's market deterrence point. I have two questions. This will also serve. We started at 8:30. Wake everybody up. So my first question, this is the easy question. How many folks before this morning had heard of the federal antitrust suits against Microsoft a decade ago and Intel last year? Both. Both. Okay. So almost everybody heard of both of them. How many folks had heard of the federal lawsuits against Dentsply a decade ago and Transitions this year? So, the amount of spill out into the marketplace from, some cases getting prosecuted, those are pretty interventionist cases.
If you asked antitrust lawyers,
Right.
if you asked,
They would know.
If you asked David Heiner at Microsoft, did he know about Transitions and Dentsply, he'd say, absolutely, I changed my compliance policy because of it.
Yeah, so you would say that there's still a flow of market deterrence through those. So the reason I brought up those little tiny cases, which are basically similar to the great big cases, although the two little tiny cases may be on average more meritorious than the two great big cases, because I don't think the FTC had much with Intel. Is to differ with Doug's remark about it isn't about whether we still have the same operating system on the PC as we had 12 years ago, or it isn't about, to take another one, AT&T, whether we have the same telephony system as we had in 1983. I would be an advocate of a limited number of highly levered for economic growth, pro-innovation antitrust cases in And that would cause me to lean against transitions. Transitions, they're the guys that make these chromatic, who crowded out Corning, according to the FTC and Corning. I'd say I think I would buy Doug's argument that there's market deterrence and be not particularly eager to go after transitions. But, IBM, AT&T, Microsoft 10 years ago, Apple 10 years from now when they've become Microsoft-like, if they do succeed in locking down the consumer and end-use device market, which I wish Hal every good luck in preventing. But if they do succeed in locking it down, they've set it up for unified technical leadership. No flash, no developer tools not approved by them, no nada. Complete control of distribution. 10 years from now, that one may well be worth a look in the interest of the future economic growth of the country.
Let me open, since we're, I want to allow some time for questions from the audience. So Paul? Yeah, do we have, yeah, we have, here we go. If you could all identify yourselves.
Paul Rubin. So yesterday we heard Reid Hoffman say that Silicon Valley runs from Washington, which I thought was a good thing to do. But in all these big antitrust cases that we're talking about, we know that competitors or customers or someone, other large firms, have been urging the government on and helping with the cases in various ways. So why is that different from running from Washington in general? And do you think that's a good idea? Because the firms that are urging cases against one guy today may be the targets tomorrow. And do you think setting that precedent is a good thing to do in antitrust?
I think it's clearly one of the unhealthy byproducts of antitrust intervention, even where the intervention was in and of itself sound, is it encourages that kind of public choice, conduct. It was striking to me, I don't know how many of you saw it, a letter to the editor of the Wall Street Journal about a month ago by the chief antitrust lawyer at Microsoft saying, things have changed in the world now, and we need vigorous antitrust to make sure the interfaces are kept open. And an intellectual property is available to rivals. I don't know whether it was IBM. They clearly had a dispute that motivated that sudden insight. Look, if you're a shareholder, if you're an executive of a company, you owe it to your shareholders to take advantage of whatever tools are available to you, even if those tools are encouraging the government to do nutty things. And that's what I think American industry is increasingly encouraged to do.
There's an even more dramatic example of this, which is private antitrust suits, right? I mean, the ultimate rent-seeking. And this debate's gone in Europe, where they were creating them. And they did. And there was all this writing in the US, and a lot of people on this side of the pond were saying this is a problem. And so this is a concern about the lack of founding, and particularly in EU antitrust policy. You see things like Apple. I mean, we talked about the iPhone. Yes, they may lock it down. As of right now, they have sub 30% market share. There are existing leading competitors already in the market. They've told Palm and BlackBerry they need to get out of their sleepy redolence and get on their innovative horses, and if they're going to survive. You may see more new forms of strategic partnerships. Google announced that they're going to accelerate some of their development plans for some of their phone services, and this becomes part of a virtuous cycle. And the idea that a 30% competitor that's innovated is going to be stomped on within 2 years of pushing the innovative market forward, to me, is the lack of discipline of market analysis, where you understand the market is not currently structured in a way with other competitors who can enter to make that likely to be a problem.
And I would say it's even worse than you suggest, because when you have excessive benefits to these, or rewards to these antitrust suits, then you get excessive entry into just pure antitrust gaming. There is a literature on treble damages, for example, that says it provides an incentive to seek to be injured. So when you're having a bunch of parties out there seeking to be injured, you end up with a lot of very, very unproductive economic activity.
Blair?
You all mentioned that antitrust is really about specifics, so I want to give you a very specific thing and get your reaction to it. When the first two cellular licenses were handed out in the early 80s, both the Justice Department and the FCC recognized fairly quickly that 2 was not going to provide sufficient competition, and through a series of actions in the 80s and 90s got a much more robust mobile market, and we're now benefiting from extraordinary innovation on that platform. But in terms of the market structure of wireless providers, we now see a change in the market structure with two providers really kind of breaking away from everybody else. And if, for example, I was a Wall Street analyst, I might note that the advantage of the spectrum position and the cost structure to that, as well as the scale that you get by virtue of a variety of, by the large size of the customer base, that those two large providers are really going to break away. And I want to emphasize, I know nothing to suggest that AT&T and Verizon have broken any antitrust laws. I'm just saying that there are things in the market that give them advantages that will keep widening the gap. So my specific question to you is there any point in time where the market, where you guys were saying that size may not matter that much, but is there any point where the market share of the top 2 is sufficient that you would be concerned just by virtue of that? Is there a tipping point in the wireless market?
The phrasing of the question is interesting, would be concerned. My guess is if I thought we were going to have an enduring monopoly, I would be concerned that, gee, this is... I'm sorry, I thought I said duopoly. I meant to say duopoly. An enduring duopoly, I'd be concerned that that's probably going to result in suboptimal performance. But if the question were different, which is there a tipping point that would be sufficient to warrant antitrust intervention? My answer is no, because a pretty good default explanation for what's happening is efficiency, as I think you suggested. And to me, antitrust intervention should be saved for provable instances of conduct that violates principles that have some of the properties I alluded to earlier. Failing that, it seems to me, just to let the market decide and let the efficiencies lead to duopolies if that's where efficiencies take you.
Well, I would go along with that, but the one point I would add is the usual problem with a duopoly is it makes it easy to collude. So I'd want to actually see some evidence of collusion, which would be an illegal act, before trying to bring any kind of antitrust remedy. So yes, you might well be concerned if there are only 2 players, but it would be their actions that would really be the determinant feature in terms of policy.
Yeah, there are lots of these markets. I don't know whether this is true of mobile telephony. There's lots of markets in computers, networking, telephony, where network effects or some other social scale economy mean there are going to be few competitors when the dust settles. And in those circumstances, it's really a good idea to get a competitive race on innovation to determine who that's going to be, and you got one or those 2, and ideally to restart that race later if it's possible. But restarting it by an anti-monopoly or anti-duopoly program seems to me to be a recipe for trouble for the reasons these guys just said.
And ever since the 80s in the contestable markets literature, we've moved away from looking at share and really focusing on things like entry barriers. So, the classic example... Well, I agree, and that's where I'm going with this next. The thing I always think strikes me about Google in search, people talk about 60% market share. Well, they weren't the first. There were much, and I think that we all know you can change your search engine very, very easily, and that in fact, they've invested tremendous amounts. They have an algorithm that works spectacularly well. And this is a form of, in my opinion, a place where market share isn't a good indicator. So as well as I do, spectrum is one entry barrier, and that's a major issue here that we have to deal with, which is a discussion of another panel here. The other problem that's really interesting to me is there are other entry barriers in wireless which are regulatory. The UMTS in Europe never deployed because there was a regulatory requirement that it be reverse compatible with GSM. And that those providers have gone to seek relief from that requirement because they can't do dual function phones. Now, this is in the face of the fact that a deployment strategy may make it very smart for them to do dual function phones. They may have strong incentives to do it already, but as a regulatory requirement where you can't have that big switch day where you could give away phones to everybody, made it so that those licenses, that spectrum languished for, I don't know how many years now, without being deployed.
One last question, because we're running out of time. Jonathan?
Yes, Jonathan Zook from the Association for Competitive Technology. This has been touched on a little bit, but it seems like one of the biggest challenges for antitrust enforcement, particularly in the high-tech industry, is about market definition itself. And where this seems to be most prominent is that we talk about this sort of public choice things, this involvement of companies in the public debate. It's really funny when the people that are involved in that debate aren't in the market as it's defined. And so one of the areas that, one of the cases that I thought was most interesting was the EchoStar DirecTV merger, for example. A lot of the public rhetoric came out of phone companies, right? Not satellite providers that were worried that their market was closing down, but came out of phone companies, which suggests that they were actually worried about competition for internet access from the satellite industry as a whole. And so that convergence created a market, a potential for competition across what would be traditionally defined markets. And that's the thing that always worries me the most about antitrust enforcement, is this incredible shell game associated with market definition.
Okay,
Should we respond?
if you want.
Yeah, well, so I hear you. Because you look at Google, it's very, very difficult to talk about market share. You just heard a figure about searches, which of course are free. Right. If you go to advertising, well, maybe Google is 2% of the world advertising market. And you look at traditional tests like snip tests. How do you run a snip test when you're selling your product using an auction? So none of it really makes any sense in this context, and you know, everything is completely up in the air with respect to what do you mean by market, and how do you define it, and how would you measure it?
But I think the more telling thing about the EchoStar DirecTV merger was not the telcos, because I mean, we all know, most people knew satellite's not much of a competitor. What was fascinating to me is all the cable companies lay in the weeds actually promoting the DirecTV EchoStar merger, even though it's going to directly be adverse to them theoretically, because they were worried that Rupert Murdoch would buy it. I mean, and that you have people gaming this system and participating in different ways, in strategic ways, which doesn't make which is a natural thing we should expect from companies, because they've got to protect their self-interests. But from an antitrust policy analysis, it's just, to me, it's a good example of how that process and the private participation in it creates some very strange incentives.
I got to get the patent. I've been against market definition in public, in writing, since 1984.
Okay.
Competitive effects. You got to look at competitive effects.
Do you want a last word?
I agree with Tim.
Thank you all very much.